Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories the Appalachian Mountains have ever kept secret in their stone and misty silence. Leave a comment about where you're watching us from now, because this story will cross borders and touch on something we all feel when we look at places that have been forgotten by time. This video is not real. It was made up for fun. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. Many Americans thought the Appalachian Mountains were the end of the known world at one point. The forests were so thick that sunlight rarely reached the ground, trails disappeared among ancient trees, and deep ravines made it seem like your voice was coming from another dimension. It was 1931, and the area between Kentucky and West Virginia still felt like it was cut off from the rest of the world, as if the 20th century had forgotten to reach it. People lived in small groups that were only connected by dirt roads that turned to mud when it rained and disappeared when it snowed. Most homes didn't have phones. News took weeks to get around, and secrets could last forever. That fall, the leaves started to fall earlier than they usually do. The older people said it was a sign of a harsh winter, but some people whispered other things, like that the forest was restless and that the air had changed. Thomas Garrett was a trader who went from village to village selling medicines, tools, and fabrics. He knew every twist and turn of those dangerous roads and every old wooden bridge that was better crossed slowly. He was well known as a trustworthy man who always came back to Harlan County, Kentucky, every Friday without fail. But one week, he just didn't come back. His wife waited one day, then two, then a whole week. When some neighbors finally offered to look for him, they found his empty wagon in a clearing. The horses were grazing peacefully, but there was no sign of Thomas. It was amazing how untouched everything was. His things were still there, organized, and nothing was stolen. He carefully folded the blanket over the driver's seat to cover the boxes. He seemed to have just gotten off the cart and walked into the woods, leaving everything behind. No one does that. No one gives up their job, which is how they support their family, for no reason. The men who found the cart followed some footprints that led into the woods, but after about 100 meters, the footprints disappeared completely, as if Thomas had just disappeared into the humid morning air. Someone then brought up the house, which was hidden in the thickest part of the woods, a place where few people would go. They said that a hermit built it years ago so he could be alone and away from everyone. The two-story building was made of dark, somewhat rotting wood, and the broken windows looked like empty eyes watching anyone who came near. No one knew for sure if anyone still lived there, but there were rumors. People always told stories about places like that. They said they saw a faint light through the trees at night, smoke coming out of the chimney even on the hottest summer days, and strange sounds echoing through the forest when the moon was full. People stayed away from that area not because they were afraid of ghosts or superstitions, but for a more basic, instinctive reason. That place just didn't feel right. The plants around it grew in strange ways, as if the ground itself was unhappy. There were no birds singing in those trees, and animals didn't make nests nearby. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like someone is watching you even when you know you're alone. After Thomas Garrett went missing, more things started to happen. These were small events that didn't mean anything on their own, but together they made a disturbing pattern. A farmer found 3 of his sheep dead near the edge of his property, arranged in a perfect circle, with no visible injuries. At dawn, a woman swore she saw a tall, thin figure watching her house from the edge of the forest. But when she called her husband, no one was there. Kids came back from playing and said that a voice from the woods had called them by name. It was a sweet and soft voice that promised to show them amazing things if they would just go a little deeper. Parents started to keep their kids closer to home. People started locking their doors earlier, and that house in the woods, the dark structure that stood among the trees like an open wound in the landscape, began to fill people's quiet conversations, nervous looks, and nightmares that woke them up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. There have always been stories and legends about the Appalachian forest that people tell around campfires too. Scare visitors, but this was different. The fear that began to spread through the communities had a real texture to it. People didn't just laugh nervously and say, "But of course, there's nothing to it." They checked their windows before bed, and every shadow among the trees became a possible threat. Samuel Blackwood was a blacksmith in a village called Thornhill, which had about 20 houses spread out along a narrow valley. He was a practical man with rough hands who didn't believe in superstitions. He snorted in disgust when he heard people talking about the house in the woods, Thomas Garrett, and the strange things that happened there. He said that people with too much time on their hands were just imagining things. He said that forests were just forests, and that abandoned houses were just rusty wood and nails. But Samuel couldn't ignore it when he saw marks on the door of his own workshop one November morning. They weren't scratches from animals. They were symbols, drawings made on purpose with something sharp, like a knife or a nail. There were circles inside of circles and lines crossing each other to make patterns that didn't make sense but seemed to be trying to say something. He sanded the wood, got rid of the marks, and didn't tell anyone. But the next week, they were back in the same place, looking exactly the same. His wife Martha finally got him to talk to other people who lived there, and that's when they found out they weren't the only ones. Several houses had the same markings, always on the front door and always at night. No one ever heard or saw who was doing it. The darkness seemed to take shape and send silent messages. Josiah Crane, the pastor of the little wooden church, thought it was time to deal with the problem directly. He suggested that a group go to the house in the woods, look around during the day, and get rid of the fear that was hurting the community. 10 men stepped up. They brought flashlights, ropes, and machetes to cut a path through the thick plants. On a clear morning in 1931, they set off. The sun was still having trouble breaking through the mist that always hung over those mountains. It took more than 3 hours to walk to the house. The path, if you could call it that, was dangerous. There were roots sticking out that felt like fingers trying to grab their ankles, low branches that came out of nowhere and scratched their arms and faces, and the growing feeling that something was watching them from the side, always out of sight, always behind the next tree. Some of the guys said they should probably turn back, but their pride wouldn't let them. They had made their plans known and said they would bring answers. They couldn't go back without anything. When they finally saw the building, it was even worse than what they had been told. It looked like the house was sinking into the ground, as if the earth was slowly pulling it down. Black moss, a type of fungus that grows in patterns that look like veins, covered the outside walls. There were a lot of holes in the roof where it had fallen in, and pale, sickly beams of light came through them. The front porch was completely falling apart, and the broken boards looked like the teeth of a dead animal. But what scared them the most was the feeling that the house was waiting for them, not empty, not abandoned, waiting, as if each dark window were an eye that finally had someone to talk to. Reverend Crane said a quick prayer, more out of habit than faith, and then took the first step toward the door. The others followed, making a line that was a little shaky, with each man holding his chosen tool a little too tightly. The door to the front was open. No one had to push it. It opened with a loud, sharp creak that echoed through the forest, making birds that had been quiet until then fly away in fear. Even during the day, the inside was dark. The windows were covered in dirt and cobwebs that had been there for decades, so they only let in a faint, greenish light that made everything look like it was underwater. The smell was the first thing they noticed. The smell wasn't like that of an empty house, which is usually the musty smell of damp wood and dust that is built up. It was something deeper and more natural, like freshly turned earth mixed with something sweet and sickening that they couldn't put their finger on, but that made their stomachs churn. As they walked in, the wooden floor creaked and groaned, which seemed too loud and intrusive in that thick silence. It was surprising how well the main room had been kept. There was a lot of gray dust on the furniture. There was a table in the middle with 4 chairs around it. All of the chairs were facing the same way, as if they had been left that way, in the middle of a conversation. Paintings that were hung crookedly on the wall showed landscapes that were unlike any they had ever seen. The mountains were taller than the Appalachians. The forests had trees that looked like they were made of something else, and the skies had colors that didn't exist in nature. William, a hunter, pointed to something in the corner of the room. There were no ashes or soot in the stone fireplace, which was big enough for a person to stand inside. Even though people said they saw smoke coming from the chimney, it looked like it had never been used. The same symbol that had been on the doors of houses in Thornhill was carved directly into the stone above the fireplace. It was a pattern of circles within circles and lines crossing each other that looked like it was moving when you looked at it for too long. Reverend Crane came closer to look at it more closely, running his fingers along the stone's grooves. They were deep, exact, and made with thought and care. They weren't just random scribbles by someone who was upset. There was a pattern to them, a math that he didn't understand but thought was important. It had a meaning. It was saying something. But what? Samuel Blackwood, a blacksmith who didn't believe in superstitions, found a door that led to what looked like a kitchen. He pushed open the damp, swollen wood and went into a smaller room where iron pots, knives of different sizes, and wooden spoons that had turned black over time still hung on hooks on the wall. Everything was set up with military precision, with each item in its proper place. There were piles of clean dishes on a stone counter, as if someone had just washed them and left them to dry. But the dust on them told a different story. Those things hadn't been touched in years. He froze when he saw the food on the table: apples, pears, and grapes arranged in a cracked ceramic bowl. They were perfectly preserved and showed no signs of decay. Their bright colors stood out in a strange way against the dead surroundings. It couldn't be done. Fruit should rot, attract bugs, and break down in a few days, but these were still there, as if time had forgotten about them or just wouldn't touch them. He called the others, and his voice shook more than he wanted it to. The men grew more and more uneasy as they gathered in the kitchen. It wasn't just the fruit. It was the growing feeling that nothing in that house followed the rules of reality. It was like they had entered a bubble where the laws of nature bent in strange but very wrong ways. There was a narrow hallway that led to the second floor. The wooden stairs creaked and groaned under their weight, and each step felt like it was going to give way. No one wanted to go up, but no one wanted to be the first to say they should turn around either. So they kept moving slowly and unwillingly toward the dark upper floor. The wallpaper in the hallway was peeling, and underneath it were faded flowers over stripes, stripes over geometric patterns, and so on. Each layer told a different story about the house's history. The upper hallway had 5 doors. 4 were locked, but 1 was open. Of course, they went to that one first, drawn to the opening like moths to a flame they knew was dangerous but couldn't stay away from. The room that was shown was a bedroom. In the middle was a wrought iron bed with a thin mattress that was covered by a white sheet that looked like it had just been made. The pillows were just right, and a blanket was folded at the foot of the bed, as if someone had gotten the room ready for a guest who was about to arrive. There were more symbols on the walls, but they were different from the ones on the fireplace. They were bigger and more complicated, covering whole surfaces from floor to ceiling. They weren't just carved. They were also painted with a dark color that had dripped in some places, making patterns that looked like rain on windows. The Reverend tried to figure out what it was, but he decided he didn't want to know. William noticed a desk that was leaning against the window. There were piles of old, yellowed paper on it. He took the top sheet and started to read. They were notes or diaries, but the handwriting changed on each page, as if different people had written there. Some entries were short, like this one, "The calling is getting stronger." Others were longer, with whole pages of dense text. The writing started out neat, but quickly turned into frantic scribbles with words repeated dozens of times, circles drawn over the letters, and sentences that made no sense in any language he knew. He stopped at one entry in particular. Just a few weeks ago, it was dated October 1931. It just said, "They came looking for me. Finally. After waiting so long, they came now. I can show them. Now I can share what I learned here. The house is satisfied." William felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at the other men in the room, who were all looking around and playing with things that might be better left alone. He was about to tell them to leave when they heard a noise coming from the ground floor, which they had just left. It was a slow, careful dragging, like something heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor, and then, without a doubt, the sound of a door closing. They all stopped moving. They looked at each other and counted without saying anything. There were 10 men in the house. There were now 10 men in that room. So, who or what was moving down there? The first person to move was Reverend Crane, who walked quickly into the hallway. The others followed him and made a tight group at the top of the stairs, looking down into the dark. The main room was not the same. The sheets that had been covering the furniture were gone, and the chairs and sofa were now dark wood with faded red velvet on them. There were now lit candles on the table in the middle. Their flickering flames made shadows dance on the walls. But the most disturbing thing was that the 4 empty chairs around the table now had people in them. They weren't really people, at least not in the usual sense. They were shapes that looked like people. Dark shapes that sat in the chairs but looked like they were made of solidified shadow. There were no clear faces on them, just hints of where their eyes and mouth should be. They were completely still, facing the stairs, as if they knew the men would come down and were just waiting with all the time in the world. Samuel was the first to go down, and his heavy footsteps broke the heavy silence. The figures didn't move when he got to the last step. They stayed seated, watching, or maybe just being in that impossible space between the real and the imagined. He took 2 more steps toward the room, and then saw something that made his blood run cold. The figures were breathing, or at least moving in a way that looked like breathing. They were rising and falling in perfect sync, as if they shared a single lung. Reverend Crane started to pray out loud, saying the same things he had said 1,000 times in church. But now they seemed empty and useless against whatever was in that place. The figures didn't respond to the prayer. Maybe they couldn't hear him, or maybe they just didn't care about the pleas of scared people who were in front of them. William was the first to notice that the front door, which they had used to get in, was now completely closed, as if someone had sealed it from the inside. He ran to it, grabbed the handle, and pushed with his shoulder. The wood didn't move at all. It felt like pushing against a wall of stone. He yelled for the others to help, and 3 men came over and pushed against the door with all their weight. Nothing. It just wouldn't move. The windows were the next clear choice, but as they got closer they saw that the glass was covered by a dark film on the outside, which they hadn't seen when they first walked in. They couldn't see the trees. All they could see was complete darkness, as if the house had been moved to a space between worlds. One of the guys picked up a chair and threw it against the window with all his strength. The glass stayed whole. The chair bounced back and broke into pieces on the floor. Things really started to get scary. People yelled suggestions over each other. "Try the other doors on the ground floor." "Go upstairs and look for windows on the 2nd floor." "Go back to the kitchen and look for a way out the back." But before they could come up with a plan, the candles on the table that all went out at the same time. Darkness came over them like a heavy blanket. People lit lanterns with shaky hands, and the light beams cut through the darkness at strange angles. It was then that they saw that the people in the chairs had moved. They weren't sitting down anymore. They were standing up, spread out around the room in ways that made it hard to get out. And they were more solid and clear now. Their dark shapes started to show more details, like long hands with fingers that looked like they had an extra joint, narrow shoulders, and necks that were longer than normal and bent at strange angles. And the looks. Oh my God, the faces started to look like clay being shaped by unseen hands, but they didn't make sense. Eyes in the wrong places, mouths opening and closing at different times, and noses moving around the face like they were alive. It was like something was trying to copy the shape of a person based only on what it had read about people, without ever having seen one in person. The result was a horrible parody that made men turn away because they couldn't understand what they were seeing. One of the figures started to make sounds that were close to human speech but not quite. Long, distorted syllables that echoed through the room from places that shouldn't have been able to. It looked like it was trying to talk, trying to make words that its body couldn't make well enough. The sound was both a plea and a threat, as well as an invitation and a warning. Everyone in the group wanted to go up the stairs, but no one wanted to turn their backs on the things in the room. Samuel then realized something very important. The figures weren't getting any closer. They stayed away from each other, as if there was some unbreakable rule that said they couldn't get closer without permission or an invitation. The house might have kept them inside, but what was inside was somehow limited. The Reverend took a step forward, feeling braver after realizing this. He held up his lantern, which lit up the closest person right away. The creature pulled back, bending backward in a way that no human spine could. It made a loud noise, almost like pain, and took a few more steps back. Light. They didn't like direct light, or maybe they just couldn't stand it. It wasn't a weapon, but it was something. The men quickly got it and made a defensive circle, each pointing their flashlight outward to make a barrier of light around the group. The figures moved back into the shadows, blending in with the dark at the edges of the room, but they didn't completely disappear. They were still there, waiting, watching, and hoping for a hole in the makeshift defense. It felt like hours, or maybe even minutes, went by like that. Time inside that house didn't work right. Some of the men had pocket watches that showed different times. The hands of these watches spun at strange speeds, sometimes moving forward and sometimes backward. They started to feel tired. Holding lanterns made their arms tired, and trying to see in the dim light made their eyes burn. And the animals were patient. They could wait for the invaders to mess up for all time. William was the one who said they should look around the second floor again. If the creatures were all on the ground floor, maybe there was something on the upper floor that explained what was going on there, or, even better, a way out. People were hesitant about the suggestion, but they couldn't just stand still. They had to do something before they ran out of energy and sanity. They climbed the stairs in a tight group, with half of them facing forward and shining flashlights on the path. The other half walked backward to make sure that nothing was following them. The upper hallway looked just like it did when they left, but now it seemed longer, as if new meters of length had been added while they were downstairs. The 4 doors that had been closed before were still closed, but now a faint blue light was coming from the cracks. It pulsed and seemed to breathe along with the house. Samuel walked up to the first door and turned the doorknob and pushed it open before anyone could stop him. The room that was shown shouldn't exist. It couldn't fit inside the house's outside dimensions. There was a huge hall in front of him, with a ceiling that was too high and walls that faded into shadows that no lantern could reach. There was a huge mosaic of colored stones on the floor that made those same circular shapes. There was something in the middle of the hall that looked like an altar. It was made of polished black stone that was smooth as glass and reflected the light from the lanterns in a strange way, making reflections that didn't match the right angles. On the altar, things were carefully arranged. Books bound in a material that didn't look like leather, with pages that glowed with writing that moved all the time and rearranged itself. Glass vials with liquids of impossible colors, some glowing and some seeming to absorb light instead of reflecting it. And in the middle, a small box of carved wood with patterns that were so detailed that it was hard to follow them. Reverend Crane felt an almost irresistible urge to go to the altar, as if something were pulling not his body, but his very being, his will. William grabbed his arm and pulled him back after he had taken 3 steps toward the structure. The touch broke the trance, and Crane staggered, breathing heavily. Even though it was cold in the house, sweat was running down his face. They quickly shut that door and went to the next one. This showed that the room was completely empty, with white walls, a white floor, and a white ceiling. There was nothing in the room, no furniture, no decorations, no windows, just empty space. But there was something in the emptiness. It was heavy. It made me feel sick to look into that space, like looking down from a high place that was dangerous. Some men said they heard whispers coming from the empty room. The voices spoke in languages that didn't exist, but they somehow conveyed pure emotions like despair, loneliness, and a hunger for companionship that had lasted for centuries. No matter how hard they tried, the third door wouldn't open. The doorknob turned, but the door stayed shut, as if there were concrete on the other side. But they could hear something through the wood, a steady, methodical knocking, like the sound of someone walking in circles over and over again without stopping. This pattern had gone on for so long that it had worn down an audible groove in whatever was on the other side of the floor. There was just the 4th door left. It was slightly open, and a little light came through. They slowly pushed it open and saw what looked like a studio. There were easels all over the room, each holding a painted canvas. The paintings were very accurate, which made them unsettling. There were dozens of portraits, and they all showed the same 10 faces. The faces of the men who were now in the room, looking at their own images on canvas. In each portrait, one of them was in a different pose at a different time. Some looked like they had been painted years ago because the canvas was old and the style of the painting was old. The paint on some of them still looked wet and new. William found 3 pictures of himself. He was holding a rifle and wearing hunting clothes in the first picture. In the second, he was sitting at the dining table in his house with a thoughtful look on his face. In the third, he was standing in that studio, just like he is now, looking at his own painting with the same look of horror that he knew was on his face at the time. It was clear and scary what the house meant. It knew them. It had known them for a long time, not just since they came in. It had watched them, studied them, and taken pictures of them when they thought no one was watching. How many times had that presence watched them without them knowing? How many nights had it been hiding in the shadows near their windows and on the edges of their properties, quietly watching them go about their daily lives? Samuel started to flip the canvases over because he couldn't stand seeing any more of those impossible pictures. But when he turned it over, he saw that there were paintings on the other side as well, and they were different. They showed places, not people. He recognized the streets of villages like Thornhill County, Harlan, and other communities in the mountains. But in the paintings, these places were empty, with no one around. There were houses with doors that swung in the wind and streets covered in leaves and branches that had fallen. It was like seeing a future where everyone had disappeared. One of the paintings showed Reverend Crane's church in great detail, but instead of the cross on top of the steeple, there was that symbol, circles inside circles. The church windows also shone with that same pulsing blue light that was now coming through the doors in the hallway. It was a prophecy or a promise, the house showing what it planned to do and how it planned to spread its power beyond those rotting wooden walls. They turned around because of a sudden noise. There were footsteps going up the stairs in the hallway, but these weren't the awkward steps of the shadowy creatures they had seen before. The steps were normal and calm, like someone who lived there and was climbing the stairs with confidence. Some of the men's flashlights were turned off so they wouldn't be seen, while others were kept on and pointed down. The person who came up the stairs looked like a person, at least. He was a tall, thin man wearing simple clothes that could have come from any time in the last 50 years. The dark hair fell over the eyes, which reflected the light of the lanterns in a strange way, like the eyes of animals that come out at night. He stopped in the hallway, turned his head slowly toward the studio, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had been alone for too long and was finally getting visitors. The man walked toward the studio, and it felt like the hallway was emptying of air. His movements didn't seem dangerous at first, but there was something very wrong with how he moved. It seemed like he was following mental instructions on how to walk, instead of just walking normally. Every move he made was too precise and planned. He looked at the group of men in the room, and then he stopped and tilted his head in a way that showed he was both curious and familiar, as if he had been waiting for them. The figure started to walk down the hallway, touching each closed door lightly, as if to say hello to old friends. The way it moved around was familiar, as if it had lived in that space for years, maybe even decades. As it walked, its fingers made patterns in the air, leaving glowing trails for a fraction of a second before they disappeared. Reverend Crane felt the need to go up to him and try to talk to him, but something deep inside his brain told him to stay away. The other men were just as tense, with their muscles ready to run, but their feet stuck to the ground by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. It was like watching a snake come closer, knowing that any sudden move could make it attack, but not being able to look away. The figure stopped in front of the door to the empty room they had looked at before. He put both hands on the wood and for a moment looked like he was listening to something on the other side. His body language made it look like he was talking, like he was answering questions that only he could hear. He then nodded, slowly and with purpose, and kept walking toward the stairs. The men followed him, but they stayed far enough away that they couldn't lose sight of him. People were starting to feel like this meeting was unavoidable, as if everything that had happened since they walked into the house had been planned to lead up to this moment. Every open door, every sign they saw, and every disturbing piece of information had brought them closer to this fight. They went down to the main room, where the dark figures were still sitting in chairs around the table. They seemed to come to life in some way when the man was there. They started to move in small ways, like waves that made it look like muscles were contracting under invisible skin. But they didn't rise up or attack. They looked at them with the same intense focus that predators use to look at possible prey. The man walked over to the fireplace and put his hand on the stone with the symbol on it. Lines of light quickly began to follow the grooves, lighting up the complicated pattern with a bluish glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The light spread over the walls, showing more symbols that were hidden in the dark, a complicated web that covered every inch of the room. They figured out that it was a map, not of places on a map, but of connections. Lines connected points and made webs that went beyond what they could see, hinting at a much bigger structure of which that house was just a node. The room started to cool down. Breath became visible, and small clouds of vapor came out of mouths that were wide open in shock and rising panic. Ice crystals began to form fractal patterns on the windows that looked like the symbols on the walls. It was like winter had suddenly chosen that spot to live, bringing months of cold into just a few minutes. The man turned to look at them, and his face changed. Not in a big way, like the shadowy creatures, but in small ways that made his features seem like they were never the same, always a little different from what they had been a second before, like looking at someone through moving water. The picture is always there, but it never stays the same. He walked over to one of the people sitting at the table. He put his hand on what would be its shoulder in a way that looked like he cared. The creature reacted, its shape getting darker and more solid as he touched it. Painfully clear features began to appear in the dark. A nose, a mouth, and eyes that opened for the first time in who knows how long. And for a terrifying moment, Samuel recognized the features. Thomas Garrett, the merchant who had gone missing weeks ago, but who had been changed and rebuilt into something that was only partly human. Thomas's face was a mask of confusion, and something that could be pain or joy, but it was hard to tell which. His mouth opened, as if to say something, but all that came out were sounds, bits of human language mixed with something older and more basic. It was like hearing someone talk underwater. You could tell they were trying to talk, but you couldn't understand what they were saying. The other people at the table also started to show features. Faces came out of the shadows at different stages of formation, some almost complete, and others only showing hints of human traits. There was a time when each of them was someone, a traveler, an explorer, or someone who just happened to be in that place and made choices that changed them. They were now in some kind of in-between state, not fully human or fully something else, stuck in a change that might never end. The man pointed to the front door in a way that clearly said "come in" or "go ahead." The symbols on the walls pulsed once, shining brightly for a short time before fading away. The heavy air that had made it hard to breathe suddenly got better, as if an unseen force had let go. William was the first to move, taking careful steps toward the door. The others followed, making a line of men who were afraid of what they would find outside but couldn't stand being there any longer. The door was open a little bit, and a thin beam of light came through the crack. The light was strange. It wasn't solar or lunar, and it didn't belong to any particular time of day. Samuel grabbed the doorknob and was shocked and relieved to find that it turned easily. The door opened without making a sound or putting up any resistance, as if it had never been locked. You could see the forest outside, but it looked different. The colors were a little less bright, like in an old picture. The trees didn't move at all, not even a single branch. They looked like a painting instead of living plants. They left in a tight group, almost running across the rotten porch, which now felt solid under their feet, even though it was in such bad shape that no plank should have given way. They stepped onto the wet ground of the forest, and only then did some of them look back. The house stayed there, with its dark windows watching like blind eyes. The man stood in the doorway, as still as a statue, and watched them go. And behind him, in the dim light of the room, he could see dozens of other people. Not just the 4 they had found at the table. They were all humanoid shapes in different stages of transformation, all facing the exit and all watching the visitors who had chosen to leave. There was no noise on the way back through the woods. No one could find the right words to describe what they had been through. The flashlights lit up the way, but the light didn't seem as strong now, and it didn't work as well against the shadows that were forming between the trees. There were no normal forest sounds like crickets, owls, or the sound of small animals moving around. It felt like I was walking through a world that had lost all its life, leaving only the empty shapes of things. It took them hours to find the main path that would take them back to their homes. When they finally got out of the thickest part of the forest, the sun was rising and the sky was full of colors that looked more real and solid than anything they had seen in the last few hours. The light of the morning touched their faces, and some men started to cry. Quiet tears of relief that they had made it through and were back in a world they knew. But there was a change in them that the light of day couldn't completely erase. They had seen something that should not have been seen. They knew something that they shouldn't have known. That knowledge was like a stone on their chests, a constant reminder that the world was much stranger, more dangerous, and less understandable than they had thought all their lives. A heavy silence hung over the communities for days after they got back, like a thick fog that won't go away even in bright sunlight. The 10 men who went into that house came out different. You could see it in their empty eyes and careful movements. They didn't talk about what they had seen, not because they had promised to keep it a secret, but because they couldn't find the right words. How do you talk about colors that you can't see? How do you talk about sounds that don't come through your ears but through your mind? Samuel Blackwood went back to his forge, but his hands shook as he held the hammer. The steady beat of metal hitting metal that he had kept up for decades of work was now erratic and unsure. He stopped what he was doing and stared at the fire in the furnace, seeing shapes in the flames that looked too much like the symbols on the walls of that house. Martha, his wife, saw that he would wake up in the middle of the night, sit on the edge of the bed, and stay there for hours, just staring at the shadows in the corners of the room, as if he were waiting for them to take shape and substance. William, the hunter, could no longer go into the woods. That place that had been like a second home to him, where he knew every tree and path, now felt like a strange and dangerous place. He looked at the line of trees on the horizon and felt his stomach tighten. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The thought of being surrounded by that thick green in that twilight where the sun had a hard time getting through made him feel scared. While he made excuses to stay in the open fields where he could see the horizon in every direction, his rifles stayed leaning against the corner of his house, collecting dust. Reverend Crane tried to find comfort in his faith, but the words he had said over and over again as a minister now sounded empty and meaningless. How could he talk about how God created the world when he had seen something much older and stranger than any theology could explain? He stood in the pulpit on Sundays, looking out at the small group of people who had come to hear him speak. He wondered if he should warn them about things they couldn't understand, forces that didn't fit into simple categories of good and evil, heaven and hell. But he always hesitated and stopped speaking before the words came out. How could he put that burden of knowledge on people who could still sleep soundly at night? The marks that had been on the doors of the houses stopped showing up after the men came back. It was as if the presence that had left them had gotten what it wanted, delivered its message, and was now happy to wait. But the lack of marks didn't make things better. Instead, it made things worse. It made people feel tense and expectant, as if something was being planned and events were already on their way to happening. Other things started to happen that were too small to be explained on their own, but when looked at together, they made a disturbing pattern. Animals acted strangely, like dogs barking at empty corners, and cats not wanting to go into some rooms of the house. No matter what time they actually stopped working, all of the clocks always showed exactly midnight. Mirrors showed images with a slight delay, which made it strange when someone turned their head and their reflection stayed looking straight ahead for a fraction of a second longer. People started having the same dreams. They weren't exactly the same, but they had the same themes and images. For example, they dreamed of walking down endless hallways with doors on either side, each leading to another identical hallway. They also dreamed of voices calling from places that couldn't be reached, always beyond the next bend and always on the other side of another door. They also dreamed of symbols writing themselves on their skin, burning without pain, but leaving permanent marks that disappeared when they woke up. But the feeling stayed, ghosts of tattoos that never existed. Martha Blackwood was the first person to say out loud what other people were thinking, but were too scared to say. At an informal gathering at the Reverend's house where husbands and wives had come together for a communal dinner, but all knew that the real reason was to talk about the fear that had settled over their lives. She put into words the fear that everyone felt. Something had followed the men back. Not in a physical way, like animals follow prey, but in a more subtle and dangerous way, a sense of awareness, as if that presence in the house had extended part of itself through the connection made that night, keeping an invisible thread connected to the 10 men who had broken into its space. The discussion that followed was tense, with voices rising in disagreement over what to do. Some people said they should get more men, go back to the house with the right tools, and burn it down, killing everyone who lived there. Others, who were more careful, said that fire might not be enough, that whatever that place was might exist outside of its physical form, and that destroying the wooden structure might just let something out that was already contained inside. Samuel finally spoke up in a low but firm voice after listening to the arguments go back and forth. Maybe the answer wasn't to destroy or fight. Maybe it was forgetting, to stop talking about the place, to stop thinking about it, to let the memory of that night fade like a bad dream that you forget about when you wake up, and to ignore the presence that clearly wanted attention and tried to make a connection. Was that even possible? Could they just decide to forget? But the fact that they were talking about forgetting was a memory, and everyone felt, even though no one said it out loud, that it wasn't a choice they would have. That experience had left a permanent mark on their minds, changing how they saw the world forever. It was like trying to forget something you already knew or see something you had already seen. The knowledge had become a part of them, changing the way they thought in ways that they couldn't just change with willpower. A new pattern started to show up in the weeks that followed. The 10 men started to pull away from their communities. Not on purpose, not as a choice, but as a slow and unavoidable process. Conversations with neighbors got shorter, and there were fewer chances to meet new people. They came together to form a circle of shared experience that no one from the outside could get into or understand. They came together in silence, sometimes just sitting together without saying anything. They were all connected by the weight they carried. William started to sketch. He had never been interested in art before, but now his hands moved without stopping across paper and charcoal, making lines and curves that slowly turned into the symbols they had seen. He couldn't stop. He would wake up with black fingers and papers all over his bed that had different versions of the same obsessive pattern on them. The drawings were too accurate and too detailed to just be from memory. It felt like something was guiding his hand, like something was using him as a tool to write down information that his conscious mind couldn't fully remember. Reverend Crane started to read old texts that he had ignored during his theological training. These were grimoires and treatises on occultism that the church officially didn't like, but they were kept in archives for academic reasons. He looked for references and historical examples of similar events, and he found more than he thought he would. Stories that spanned centuries and cultures, houses that existed outside of normal time, places where realities overlapped, and beings that lived in the spaces between worlds. The specifics were different, but the main idea was too consistent to be a coincidence or a myth. One discovery that kept him up for 3 nights was a story from 1876 about a group of miners in West Virginia who found a buried building while they were digging. They said they went into a group of rooms that shouldn't have fit inside the measurements they had taken from the outside. They talked about symbols on the walls and beings that were not hostile but very strange. Only 5 of the 12 miners who went in came out. The others just vanished, and the survivors could never clearly explain what had happened. He couldn't help but see the similarities with his own life. During one of their quiet meetings, he told others about what he had found. People looked sad when they heard the news, but they weren't surprised. In a way, it confirmed what everyone thought. That house in the woods wasn't one of a kind. It was part of something bigger, a network of places spread out over a wide area that were connected by rules that people couldn't understand. And if there were other places, there were other people who had been through the same things and who carried the same heavy knowledge that was bothering them. Samuel suggested that maybe they should look for these other people, create a network of survivors, share information, and learn from each other how to deal with the effects of having seen things that are not normal. The idea had some good points, but it also had some bad ones. Bringing together people who had been affected by these forces could make their connection to the places that had changed them stronger. It might be just what those beings wanted, to help them get to the world through networks of people who are connected. They talked about these problems in more and more complicated ways without coming to any good conclusions, but then something changed. William was the first to see it. The drawings he had been making over and over for weeks started to change on their own. When he wasn't looking, lines he had drawn in certain places moved and changed into new shapes. The symbols were changing and getting more complicated, as if they were growing up on their own. And with each new version, he felt a deeper understanding, not intellectual, but gut level, that those patterns meant something important, something his mind was slowly learning to read. The change in William's drawings was just the start. The 10 men started to show other signs, each going through changes that were different but related. Samuel found out that he could feel metal in ways he had never felt before. When he held an iron bar in his forge, he could feel more than just its weight and temperature. He could also feel its molecular structure, tiny flaws, and the history of the material since it was taken from the ground. It was knowledge that didn't need words. It was information that was just there in his mind, as if it had always been there. Reverend Crane started to hear bits of other people's thoughts. Not full mind reading, nothing that clear, but when he was around other people, he heard echoes of their worries and flashes of their feelings, like radio static that came and went. He hadn't asked for it and couldn't stop it, so it was disturbing and intrusive. He started to stay away from crowds and instead spent time alone, where his mind could be free from the psychic impressions of other people. The wives also saw the changes. Every day, no matter when Samuel went to bed, Martha saw him wake up exactly 3 minutes before dawn. His body had gotten in sync with a rhythm that didn't follow human clocks. He would stand by the window and watch as the horizon slowly changed from black to gray and then to the colors of dawn. She could see his lips moving, as if he were counting something that only he could see. William stopped eating meat, not because he thought it was wrong or for moral reasons, but because his body didn't want it. He felt sick right away if he tried to eat animal protein, as if his body had been changed so that it could only digest plants. He lost weight, and his face became sharper and more angular. His wife tried to make him thick soups and rich breads, but he could only eat a little bit before his stomach hurt. The dreams they all had got stronger. They didn't just have similar themes, they had the same experiences. All 10 men wanted to be in the same place at the same time, walking through those endless hallways and exploring together, even though their bodies were sleeping in different beds. In these dreams, they saw things like doors that opened into rooms that were impossible to enter. Each room had things or ideas that their waking minds couldn't understand, but in the dream state, they seemed perfectly normal. They all had the same dream about a room one night. It was round, and the walls were covered in the symbols that they now knew by heart. A fountain in the middle flowed up instead of down, going against gravity and making patterns in the air that were hard to look away from. People who had gone through the whole metamorphosis and come out as something else were waiting around the fountain. They were not the shadowy creatures they had seen in the house. They were more defined and solid. They didn't talk, but they communicated through feelings, sending messages of welcome and support that made the 10 men feel like their journey had a purpose that was bigger than they could understand. When they woke up, each man had the same clear memory of the dream. They found that even the smallest details matched perfectly when they got together to talk about it. These were not separate visions that were interpreted in the same way. They were a real, shared experience, as if their minds had actually met on a level that was separate from physical reality. It was both interesting and scary to think about what else could get into that space if they could meet there. What else lived in those dream worlds? On a cold December afternoon, Martha faced Samuel. She couldn't ignore the changes any longer. She could no longer act like everything would go back to normal if they just waited long enough. She wanted answers. She wanted to know what was going on with her husband and all the other men who had come into that horrible house. Samuel tried to explain, but it was hard to find the right words to describe what had happened without sounding completely crazy. The more he spoke, though, the more he saw the fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him. Fear of what he was becoming. She asked him a simple question he couldn't answer. Will this stop? Will there come a time when the changes stop and you stay the same? Or is it an ongoing process, a transformation that will only end when there is nothing human left? Samuel opened his mouth to tell her everything would be fine, but the words died before they could form because he didn't know. He had no way of knowing. Thomas Garrett was weeks or even months ahead of them in that process, and what he had become was only partly human. Was this going to happen to all of them? People in the community started to talk about the 10 men, but not openly or with direct accusations. They would stop talking whenever one of the 10 men came near. People talked about witchcraft, demons possessing them, and the curses they had brought on themselves by getting involved in things that should have been left alone. The Reverend tried to calm people's fears by using his position, but this hurt his own credibility. How could he talk about God's goodness when he was clearly changing in ways that no Christian theology could explain? William made a choice. If change was unavoidable, and there was no way to stop what had already started, maybe they should accept it instead of fighting it. Return. Instead of living in this painful uncertainty, go straight to the source and ask them what was going on and why. People had mixed feelings about the proposal. Some agreed, thinking that it would be better to face the situation than to go through this slow, painful change without knowing why. Some people backed off, saying that going back would mean giving up completely and speeding up the change instead of trying to keep it under control. Samuel was in a tough spot. He really wanted answers, but another part of him, the part that still saw himself as a blacksmith, a husband, and a member of a community, was afraid that going through that door again would be the end of his life. That up until now, even with all the changes, there was still a chance of keeping some kind of normal life. But if they went back and actively sought out more contact with that presence, they would be choosing a path that would take them away from everything they knew. They put off making a decision, but the stress of having to choose between doing something and doing nothing grew. Every day, the changes showed themselves in new ways. Robert, a farmer, woke up one morning and found that he could see in the dark. Not vaguely, not just getting used to the twilight, but with perfect clarity, like it was noon. He could see so well at night that he could count the threads in fabrics by the light of the stars. Another man became very sensitive to vibrations and could feel people walking 100 meters away through the ground. These skills were helpful, and in some situations they were even admirable. But they also came with costs. Robert found out that being in direct sunlight now hurt him, so he had to wear wide-brimmed hats and stay in the shade as much as possible. The man who was sensitive to vibrations couldn't sleep well anymore. Any movement in the house would wake him up right away. There was a cost to the gains, and the cost was rising. Winter got worse in the Appalachians, and snow fell, covering the forest in white silence. The house, that cursed place that started it all, became even more cut off. The trails that led to it were buried under layers of frozen water, but all 10 men knew exactly where it was. They could feel it like an internal compass that always pointed in the same direction. Even with their eyes closed and feeling completely lost, they knew instinctively which way to go to get back there. The connection had been made, and it couldn't be broken by just being far away. A snowstorm at the end of January cut off communities for days. White drifts that were up to an adult man's waist covered the roads. Families stayed inside their homes and burned wood to keep the deadly cold out. During these long, dark nights, dreams became stronger and more real, as if nature had made the perfect conditions for that other reality to break through the weak barriers of human consciousness. Samuel dreamed that he was walking through the snow to get home. His feet didn't leave any footprints in the dream. They didn't sink into the white surface. He floated above it, as if he had chosen to ignore the idea of weight. The snow changed the forest around it. Each tree stood out against the gray sky like a white pillar, and the branches bent under the weight of the snow. But the sizes were off. The trees were too tall and the gaps between them were too wide, as if the geography had been stretched overnight. The house in their dream was also different when they got there. The structure was still made of dark wood, but now it had new wings growing out of the sides like living things, and extra rooms multiplying like cells. The house was getting bigger and bigger, getting ready to hold more people. And the lights in the windows were on. They weren't the sickly blue light they had seen before. They were warmer and more welcoming, like the house was waiting for its owners to come home. Even though it was cold in the room, he woke up sweating. Martha slept next to him, breathing normally, not knowing what was going on in his head. Samuel carefully got up so he wouldn't wake her up, went to the window and looked outside. The snow had stopped coming down. The sky was getting clearer, and the first colors of dawn were painting the clouds in pink and gold. The world looked normal and peaceful, with a clean white blanket covering everything and hiding all of its flaws. But he knew that dream was real. It was a message, an invitation, or maybe even an order. It was time to go home. All 10 of them, not just him. It was time to go back and finish what they had started on that first night when they crossed the threshold without really knowing what they were doing. It was useless to fight back now. They could put it off or fight the urge, but in the end they would all give in. It was only a matter of time. The other people had the same dream. When they met 3 days later, after some of the roads had been cleared, they both told the same story. The walk through the snow, the bigger house, and the lights in the windows. There was no longer any question about whether they should go back. The question now was when and how. Some people wanted to leave right away because they felt like they had to go right away, which made each day of waiting painful. Others said that they should get ready and try to learn more about what they would face before fully committing. William came up with a plan. They would go during the day, when the sun was shining, which would give them some mental protection, if not physical protection. They would bring enough food and water for a few days in case they got stuck again. And most importantly, they would bring things to write down what they found, like paper, ink, and drawing tools. If they were going to change and slowly lose their humanity, at least they would leave a record of how it happened, a warning for others who might accidentally do the same thing. It took a week to get ready. At that time, the changes sped up for all of them, as if the choice to go back had removed some kind of blockage that was keeping the change at a steady pace. Samuel learned that he didn't have to eat all the time anymore. He could go days without being hungry, and when he did eat, even small amounts were enough to fill him up. His body was getting better at using less fuel to keep working, or maybe it was learning how to get energy from sources that normal people can't reach. Reverend Crane stopped getting sleep. He didn't need to sleep anymore. It wasn't insomnia or an inability to rest. At night, he would lie down, close his eyes, and his mind would go into a peaceful state of meditation. He still had dreams, but now he was awake during them and could see the stories unfold while part of him stayed awake and thought about them. Being in 2 states at once was unsettling, but he slowly learned how to deal with it. William saw that his sense of time was changing. Time seemed to stretch or shrink in ways that clocks didn't show. He thought a conversation that lasted. Hours had only lasted minutes, and a walk that he thought had only taken minutes had taken an hour. His subjective sense of time was not in sync with the objective passage of time. He thought about whether he would one day live completely outside of time, experiencing the past, present, and future all at once instead of in a linear way. The wives said goodbye to them with looks that showed both love and acceptance. They knew that the men who left would not be the same ones who came back. Martha hugged Samuel for a long time, remembering how it felt to have his arms around her, and how the smell of forge smoke always clung to her clothes. She didn't say, "Don't go." She didn't ask him to stay. She knew that there was no real choice and that he was being pulled by forces that no one could control. She only said softly that she loved him and would always love him, no matter what he became. She hoped this would be true, even when she had to deal with changes she couldn't even imagine yet. There was no sound on the trip through the snowy woods. The 10 men walked in a line, following paths that only they could see under the uniform white. They didn't need a map or a compass. The house pulled them like a magnet, and every step brought them closer to their goal. Animals watched from a safe distance, their eyes shining between the trees, but none came closer. They could tell that these people were carrying something strange, something that animal instinct knew was dangerous or just hard to understand. When the house finally came out of the trees, it looked just like it did in the dreams. It had grown, changed, and new architecture had sprouted from its original structure like mushrooms growing from a fallen trunk. The additions didn't make sense from a construction point of view. For example, angles that shouldn't work, walls that curved in ways that aren't possible in geometry, and windows arranged in ways that hurt your eyes to try to follow. But somehow, it all worked together, going against not only physics but also common sense about how things should be in three-dimensional space. The front door was wide open, not just ajar like before. Warm light streamed out, making a golden rectangle against the snow. The chimney sent up a straight column of smoke that didn't move even though the wind blew. Someone or something had gotten the place ready for them. There was a sense of expectation in the air, almost like the house itself was looking forward to their return. Samuel was the first to step over the line this time, and he did so without hesitation or looking back to make sure the others were okay. He just did what he had to do since the moment they left that place weeks ago. The others followed him in silence, each carrying a backpack full of supplies that they somehow already knew they wouldn't need. They wouldn't need food or water where they were going. The rules were different here, in this place that only partly existed in the real world they had known all their lives. The inside was completely changed. The room that had been messy and scary was now clean, organized, and almost welcoming. Furniture arranged in ways that made sense, rugs on the wooden floor, and paintings on the walls of landscapes that were strange but had a certain alien beauty. It was like the house had gotten ready for guests by putting on its best face to impress and calm them. Even though the shadowy figures couldn't be seen, they could be felt. They were watching from the edges of perception, waiting in the shadows that no lantern could fully penetrate. There was a guardian in the middle of the room, standing like a host, welcoming guests. He was not fully human. He was a link between humans and whatever lived there. He smiled when he saw them, and this time it looked real instead of like a carefully planned mask. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just pointed to the stairs, telling them to go up. Upstairs, in rooms they hadn't fully explored the first time, there was a whole universe of knowledge waiting for them. This time would be different. They weren't scared of intruders anymore, even if they were stumbling through mysteries they didn't understand. They were new members, coming back to take the next step on a journey that had just begun. They climbed the stairs in silence, and with each step, they went deeper into something that went beyond the physical structure. The hallway on the second floor went on for a long time in both directions, much longer than the outside of the house would let it. There were doors on both sides, some open and showing glimpses of impossible interiors, and some closed but giving off a pulsing blue light that they now knew meant something was waiting on the other side. The guardian led them through a maze of hallways and rooms, each one showing them a different side of what that place really was, not just a house, but a meeting place, a library of knowledge that people had forgotten or never knew, and a collection of possibilities that existed on the edge of what was known and what was impossible. They walked through rooms where gravity worked in strange ways, where colors that had no name painted the walls, and where the air vibrated with frequencies that made their bones vibrate in harmony. Samuel felt something inside him let go. The last bit of attachment he had to his old self, the resistance he had kept up, just went away. It didn't hurt. It was freeing, like getting rid of a heavy burden he had been carrying for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to live without it. He looked at his hands and saw that they were changing, becoming more see-through, as if he were looking through several versions of himself that were all in the same space. William stopped in front of one of the open rooms and recognized the place from his dreams. He could now read the symbols on the walls as if they were a native language. The water fountain that flowed up was also there, and around the fountain were the changed figures they had seen before. But this time he saw some familiar faces. Thomas Garrett was there, and he looked completely different, but somehow more real and alive than he ever had as a regular person. He waved, which was a sign of welcome and support. Reverend Crane finally got it. It wasn't about losing humanity. It was about going beyond it, becoming something bigger and more complex that could see and exist in dimensions that the limited human form couldn't. The change wasn't the end. It was the start of something new, a true metamorphosis, and those who finished it didn't stop existing. They just existed in a different, bigger way. The 10 men spread out around the house, each finding a place that spoke to their own journey. There was no need to rush now. Time moved differently inside those walls. They could explore for days, or even years, but only a few hours would have passed in the real world. Or maybe it was the other way around. It didn't matter anymore. They had left behind the normal cause and effect pattern that governs everyday life. Samuel walked into a room full of tools he had never seen before, but he knew right away how to use them. They were tools for shaping not only metal, but also reality itself. He could make things here that couldn't be made anywhere else, things that would break every physical law he thought he knew. He wasn't afraid of the prospect. Instead, it made him feel something like joy and gave him a new sense of purpose on a scale he had never thought possible. William learned that his drawings were just the beginning. Now he could see the whole patterns, the sacred geometry that made up the structure of life. And he could do more than just see. He could change things. Small changes here and there would spread through complicated systems, changing results in small but important ways. It was a huge responsibility, but it was also a gift that had been freely given. The guardian had a look of paternal pride on his face as he watched them explore. He had led many people through this journey over the course of decades, maybe even centuries. Each group brought its own questions, fears, and discoveries, and each eventually found its place in the larger structure that this place represented, a community that existed beyond the normal limits of space and time, connected by a shared understanding that reality was much more flexible and strange than most people would ever think. The 10 men came back together in the central room a few hours or days later. It's hard to say for sure. They were different now, not in a big way that would be obvious to someone who wasn't paying attention, but in a big way. They acted differently and saw the world through eyes that saw layers that weren't there before. They had accepted the change, and were happy with what they were becoming. This time, when they left the house, they knew they would come back. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They had become as much a part of this place as it had become a part of them. The link was permanent and could not be broken. As they walked back through the forest, the snow crunching under their feet, they could feel other places like this scattered throughout the mountains. These were places where the veil was thin, and where others might find mysteries that would change their lives forever. The people they left behind would keep doing what they usually do. People would plant and harvest crops, make tools, and pray. People who chose to stay within their comfort zones would continue to live normal lives. But for the 10 who had seen beyond and chosen not to look away, a whole new world of possibilities had opened up. And the trip was just getting started. The house would stay where it always had been, hidden in the woods, waiting patiently. There would always be people who looked for it and were drawn to strange places where things don't work the way they should. When they got there, they wouldn't see horror. They would see change. They wouldn't see an end. They would see the start of something their old minds couldn't have understood or imagined. If you've come this far with us on this trip through the dark parts of Appalachia, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. These stories go on, and there are many more mysteries to solve in the new stories we have planned for you.